All right, we're going to go through some of these videos for period 6 because I was going to give y'all some packets and you're not here. So for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to record some videos by watching videos of chapters 24, 25, 26, and I'm going to kind of stop and talk about what's going on here. So this will really serve as your um, here's what I would do. I would take notes if I were you. So I would take notes on all of these videos. You can write them down or you can type them out however you want to, but just make sure that you're paying attention to what's important. If you have questions or you need clarification about things, obviously you can call or you can message me, but also feel free to go look in your book and read your book about any issues or whatever that you need clarification on. So we're just going to listen to this, and I'll stop it at certain times, and we'll just go from there.
Bush. Today we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution, roughly from the Civil War all the way up until 1900. A couple things to know about the Industrial Revolution. By 1900, America would become the leading industrial power in the world. It's going to be a rapid economic transformation of American society, and this is going to impact the country economically, socially, and politically. And really, manufacturing is going to replace agriculture as the primary source of economic growth. And as a result of this rise of big business, you're going to have massive migrations, huge amounts of immigrants coming in, people moving within the United States, as well as urbanization.
Okay, so there's a lot to talk about here. All of these things, all of these little themes here, these 4 themes, you need to be able to show how those things are happening as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So for each one of these, I would be thinking about like maybe creating a heading for each one of these in your notebook. And then as you go through, as we go through this chapter, as you read, if you want to go read, try to list pieces of specific factual information that would support this, and then explain how that specific factual information supports it. Because there's a lot here. These are they're essentially main ideas, big ideas for this particular chapter. So you're going to want to be able to support these to show how these things took place. So this is an important part of this, this chapter and particularly of this lecture.
Moving to the cities. And so key to this is there's a huge number of inventions and innovations taking place, and this allows for greater productivity. A large number of new inventions are developed during this period, and a huge number of patents are issued. And as a result, some of those kind of key ones, Alexander Graham Bell introduces the telephone, Thomas Edison with all of his inventions at Menlo Park with the electric light. And this allows for new changes to take place, because these inventions and innovations will change daily lives. They'll create new jobs for people and have social consequences. And you could see that in the image right there with women entering the workforce as receptionists, secretaries.
All right, now, I didn't mention this, but I want to make sure that it's clear. All of this is taking place after the Civil War. So a lot of what was going on during the Civil War, especially in the North with industrialization, is people were coming up with new inventions, and they were coming up with new effective ways to produce goods and produce the things that they needed for war. And all of that innovation really spurred on this new industrial revolution that's going to take place after the Civil War. Okay, now, as far as this particular page goes, large number of new inventions developed during this period, high rate of patents issued. You got Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone, Thomas Edison with the electric light. These are important pieces of specific factual information, but you also need to know what these inventions led to, what their impact was. It's not enough to just say, well, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Okay, what was the impact of these innovations? And here is the impact. These innovations will change daily lives. They will create new jobs and have social consequences. Okay? In particular, this creating new jobs, because industry is going to use these innovations to become more productive, and they're going to have to hire people to run these new machines. Social consequences, you're going to have more women going into the workplace because now they're going to work as secretaries and things of that nature, which they hadn't had before. But they've got this telephone now where they're able to go into the workplace and answer phones for businesses. Okay, so all of these inventions, they have major impacts on society. So make sure that you're able to identify those and understand why these things are important.
Secretaries and other positions within companies. Now, the first big business in this era is going to be the railroads, and there's a huge increase of railroad production after the Civil War, and it is really the result of land and loan subsidies given by the federal government to the railroad companies, meaning fewer.
All right, now, one of the main reasons for the success of the railroad industry is because of this. Land and loan subsidies given by the federal government to railroad companies. What that means is the federal government was literally giving railroad companies loans, loaning them money, those are subsidies, and they were giving them land subsidies, meaning that they're literally giving them plots of land. So the railroads, they didn't invest as much into their industry as, as somebody might invest in their own business if they're starting from scratch and have no help. They had help. They didn't have to buy a lot of this land. They didn't have to go to banks and try to get loans at high rates. So by getting these government favors, essentially, they're able to become widely successful, and they're able to kind of start their industry on the right foot, as opposed to having to struggle and fight for every little thing that they needed in order to be successful. So the government really helped railroads. Why would the government do that? That's the question. Well, it does that in this particular situation because the government thinks that having these railroads will help the economy, which ultimately it does. All right, and then just kind of be familiar with new business practices that are going to be introduced by railroad companies, like the modern stockholder corporation. And then consolidation leads to standardization of the industry, steel, rail, and standard gauges. What that means is instead of having different width of railroad tracks in, say, Texas and having something different up here in Nebraska, they would have the same railroad width, or railroad tracks would have the same width. They would use the same kind of steel. They would use the same, everything that they used to produce a railroad, it all became standardized where it was all the same. So it made it easier for these railroads to connect to one another. It made it easier for the steel industry to produce rails, railroad rails. So, that way they could sell it to different companies. It was all the same for them. So that's what standardization means.
And fewer railroad companies are controlling the market, which is also going to lead to standardization of the industry. For instance, the steel rail, the transition to the steel rail, and standardizing gauges, the width between the track. This is key to allow for greater efficiency. As a result of the growth of the railroad, you also have this huge movement of people out into the Trans-Mississippi West. And we're going to cover.
Okay, railroads essentially leads to more Western expansion. So that's what this is showing. You've got settled by 1870, that's all of this. Settled by 1880, that's these little plots here. And then settled by 1890. So more and more land in the West is becoming settled, mainly because of railroad industry. All right, next let's look at the Transcontinental Railroad. The Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 is what the government passed in order to allow this to take place. And it was going to start in two places. It was going to start in Omaha. You see this little map over here. One group of workers would start in Omaha. Another group of workers would start in Sacramento, and they're going to work towards each other. The Union Pacific was the company that built the railroad from Omaha to the west, And mostly Irish workers were part of this. Think about the East Coast, and these Irish workers come to Omaha and they build this way. And then you had Chinese workers who had come from China, were the ones that were working on for the Central Pacific Railroad. They were working on the railroad from Sacramento all the way to this point, which was known as Promontory Point. Now, if you'll notice, this track is longer than this track. You got to be asking yourself, why would that be? Well, think about right here. They're going through mountainous terrain, whereas over here, it's relatively flat. So it was they had an easier time of it, at least in the initial stages of the railroad building on this side more so than over here.
At Promontory Point, when the two companies meet and the Golden Spike is laid, marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. And this is going to have huge consequences. The building of the railroads are going to have huge impacts. It's going to unify the domestic market, create a national market for goods. It allows for the mass distribution of raw materials and manufactured goods from coast to coast. It's going to encourage mass production, mass consumption, and economic specialization. Different parts of the country are going to be specializing on certain products. And finally, it's going to help promote the growth of other industries, for example, coal, steel, etc., and lead to the growth of new cities. If your city's by a rail station, you're going to have a true.
All right, so real quick, the impact of the railroad, you got to know this. The market becomes connected. The market in the east and the market in the west become connected. So now, if I'm producing goods in New York, well, they can ship all the way to Sacramento. So that gives me a new base of customers that helps to grow my business. So that's what it means by creating a national market. Now, goods that are produced on one side of the country are actually goods that can be distributed to other parts all the way across the continent to the western part of the country. Mass distribution of raw materials and manufactured goods. Obviously, all of these manufactured goods and raw materials can be moved from one place to another, long distances, which helps to create a national market. Mass production, mass consumption, economic specialization. In other words, if I can now sell goods to people not just in my little region, like let's say in Gunnersville, now I can sell goods all the way across the country into parts of Texas or parts of California, well, then I'm going to create more goods. So that's what mass production is. So we got to come up with new techniques so that we can produce these goods more efficiently and on a larger scale, okay? Mass consumption, that is the consumers. They're engaged in buying all these goods and services, okay? And economic specialization. Essentially what that means is you have, like the railroads, they're mainly in charge of transporting goods, okay? You have the steel industry, they're mainly in charge of creating the rail. So you have economic specialization. Instead of somebody creating an entire product, making sure it gets taken, taking it to a customer and building whatever they need to build to ship those goods to that customer, you have more specialization taking place in the economy. And this promotes the growth of other industries, especially steel, coal, etc. So these are the major beneficiaries to the railroads. The railroads really are what fire up the economy, and all these other industries benefit as a result.
Tremendous growth as a result. It's going to facilitate immigration both internally and externally, and it's going to change the lives of Americans. In fact, the American Railroad Association divided the country into 4 time zones in 1883 so that there could be greater efficiency, and later on the government would adopt that as well. Now, we got a problem here because there was...
All right, so make sure you know about time zones. They're created because of railroads.
A lot of corruption and wrongdoing in the railroad industry. If you remember from previous lectures, the Credit Mobilier scandal, you had government officials being bribed by the railroad companies. And these railroad tycoons are becoming extremely powerful. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt are amassing huge amounts of wealth, and as a result, federal land grants and friendly loans led that corruption to seep into the government. You're going to have frequent speculative bubbles where you have overbuilding taking place, and that overbuilding will lead to economic chaos. Speculators are attempting to sell overvalued stock to the public, and as a result, this overbuilding leads to companies going bankrupt very frequently. Mismanagement and fraud plague the industry. Rebates or discounts were oftentimes given to favored shippers, so there was all sorts of different pricing. And as a result of this, small farmers were often charged higher rates than others, and they're going to be the victims of the powerful railroad companies. And pools were created, and pools were secret agreements between the companies to fix rates and share profits. So there really wasn't fair competition taking place.
All right, real quick, let's go back here. All right, so we talked about all the good things. Here are all the bad things that resulted because of the success of the railroad industry. You have railroad tycoons like Vanderbilt who become really powerful. They exert their influence over government officials, get a lot of things done in government that benefit them, and maybe they hurt other industries or hurt other owners within their own industry. Whatever it is, they're able to use their influence to gain some favor with government officials. Here's an example: federal land grants and friendly loans led to rampant corruption within the government. By the way, this is not the result of capitalism. This is the result of government getting involved. If you just let people, businesses, industries compete within their industry and against one another without government interference, without government helping one over another, then you have a healthy, robust capitalist system. This is not what was taking place here, okay? Frequent speculative bubbles would burst. Speculators would attempt to sell overvalued stock to the public. Overbuilding was common. Mismanagement and fraud plagued the industry. Rebates, make sure you know what those are. Make sure you know what pools were. All right, so those were the bad aspects of the railroad industry.
Companies to fix rates and share profits. So there really wasn't fair competition taking place. And as a result of this concern over the railroad's power over the public and the government, there began to be discussions about should the government regulate. There starts to be demands that the government should intervene. Now keep in mind the dominant philosophy of the time is laissez-faire, leave alone, no regulation, but farmers become the most vocal group in calling for reform. And really you see that in the Grange movement. We're going to cover that in another video, but the Grange movement is an organization of farmers demanding change. And they get some regulations. In the famous case of Munn versus Illinois in 1877, the court rules the state could regulate business.
First of all, I've told y'all before, this idea of laissez-faire, leave alone, no regulation, it's kind of it's not really accurate, okay? Correct. There was very little regulation when it came to these industries. However, there were a lot of laws that were being passed that helped certain companies benefit over others or encouraged the growth of certain industries, or where government ignored certain violations that were occurring within certain industries because everybody was getting rich off of it. That is not leave alone, hands off. That is, let's help this company, let's help this industry, and we're going to pass laws that do that, and then you don't have a real competitive capitalist market, okay? So don't fall under the illusion that this was, the government wasn't involved in any of this. They were just innocent bystanders. No, that is not true. Now, Munn versus Illinois, this was a court case which ultimately gave states the right to regulate businesses, which they already had, but this pretty much confirms it.
However, Munn versus Illinois, those Granger laws, as they were called, are overturned in the Wabash case when the court ruled that states could not regulate interstate commerce. And interstate commerce is trade between different states. And the public begins to demand that the federal government does something to overhaul the capitalist system. during the Gilded Age. And you get the Interstate Commerce Act passed in 1887. And it does a couple of things. It sets up the Interstate Commerce Commission. The federal government would oversee business. They would ban pooling, rebates, and rate fixing. And companies, railroad companies, had to publish rates. Now,
Okay, so those are some regulations that were passed as a result of the Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, this commission was not very effective. It didn't have a lot of power, but it also didn't really want to do a lot of things because everybody was getting rich. All these politicians were getting rich. They were gaining influence with wealthy people, and wealthy people were gaining influence with them. So they were all just kind of in this weird, connected, strange economic growth together, and they didn't want to really do anything to mess that up. So that's kind of where we're at.
Railroad companies had to publish rates. Now, the Interstate Commerce Commission is important. It is the first large-scale attempt by the federal government to regulate business in the interest of society at large. So the government is watching and monitoring business.
The government, the most corrupt organization that has ever existed on the planet, is going to watch for us. They're going to regulate business to protect society at large. That's great.
Now, important to keep in mind, the ICC was initially not very effective.
All right, we're going to stop there, and I'm going to finish this video with another video that you'll watch later on.